This is Tom Kozlik, the head of public policy and municipal strategy at Hilltop Securities. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this episode of our Hilltop Talks Politics and Finance podcast series for 2026. As a reminder, during this Hilltop Talks discussions with subject matter experts, we consider topics that intersect the areas of politics and finance at the federal, state, and local levels in the U.S. We often concentrate on issues related to U.S. public finance and the municipal bond market. Today, we're going to discuss the impact of the escalation of the war in the Middle East and its impact on oil and other prices. It seems energy markets and the price of oil is carrying a lot more weight than usual, more than I've ever seen. Energy, or should I say specifically oil prices and refined product prices, are moving less on just the demand cycles like they usually did or usually do, and much more on geopolitics now. We're going to discuss this in more detail with Walter Kunisch, the Hilltop Securities lead commodity strategist. Walter is going to help us break down what constrained supply, tighter inventories, and rerouted global trade means for energy markets. Walter, thanks for joining us today.
Tom, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Walter, big picture. We're at the end of May 2026. Summarize, kind of break down where we are right now with regard to all the stuff that's been happening from an economic perspective, from an energy market perspective, and from a geopolitical perspective in the Strait.
Yeah, Tom, those are a lot of big words, and those words have been coming kind of across our desk for, really since Operation Epic Fury started at the end of February. And, I think being here heading into Memorial Day weekend, myself, probably, most Americans around the country and, citizens of the world are looking at, you're going to the gas pump, they're going to the grocery store, they're opening up their utility bills, and they are just shocked. It's easy to sit back, a few thousand miles away and look at what's gone on over in the Persian Gulf and in the Middle East. And it's easy to point the finger and say, well, prices are higher. But why are they higher? We know that Iran is a key energy producer in the world. And we know that the states that surround Iran inside the Persian Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, are all critical suppliers of energy products. And when we say energy products, Tom, we're not just talking about crude oil. Crude oil is extremely important, but those countries also export other refined products like jet fuel, which is sent to Europe. They produce gasoline, diesel fuel, liquid natural gas. And the conflict over there has contracted global supplies to the tune of about a 20 to 21 million barrel of crude oil supplies lost by not traveling through the Straits of Hormuz. And that's helped elevate global energy prices. Because as we've seen a supply constraint, again, with loss of about 21 million barrels a day of crude oil in refined products flowing through that strait, supplies across the world are being reduced, which is helping elevate prices.
So, how many barrels of crude oil, jet fuel, and some of these other energy related products, how many barrels pass through the strait on a daily basis before Operation Epic Fury?
So before Operation Epic Fury, that region of the country, the Strait of Hormuz, represented about 20 to 21 million barrels a day of crude oil and refined products. And we say refined products is meaning that's jet fuel, gasoline, diesel fuel, and other types of energy derivatives that are part of the refining process in that region. And that region represents about 20 to 25% of all energy that's transited throughout the world.
Okay, so that's 20 million for all of those categories before. What does the situation look like now?
About zero. It's about as bleak as you can get. And ultimately, what the world is looking at right now is one of the greatest energy supply shocks in modern time. And that's not an overemphasis. That is true. That is a reality.
So can you break down, you mentioned it was 20, I think you said it was 20%. I mean, how much overall production is being lost from the Strait?
There's a term that's called shut in, and that term kind of shut in means that's production that's being locked inside those oil and energy producing countries inside the Persian Gulf. And some of those countries, again, like I mentioned, are Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Iran. And the amount of crude oil kind of on an estimated daily basis that's being shut in or supplies that are building locally and not making their way through the Strait of Hormuz into the rest of the world is about 9.5 million barrels a day. Before the conflict, production in the region was about 8.5 to 10 million barrels a day of crude oil production. But again, as you know, as kind of time goes by, as each passing week continues from Epic Fury, oil wells are being shut down, local so supplies are being contracted, not just that's coming out of the ground, but tank supplies in that region are also being built. So production and supplies are kind of being shut into that region.
So what does the loss of that scale mean for the world and for the world energy markets?
It's monumental. And what that region represents through the Middle East is that they're a major supplier of energy to really to Europe, to some parts of Africa. African countries have an ability to be somewhat self-sufficient or kind of export around themselves. But really, there's been acute supply losses or energy supply losses in countries like India, but really specifically inside of Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is home to some of the largest crude oil refineries in the world. Specifically, those are located in China, South Korea, and portions of Singapore. So, with kind of each passing week, each passing month, that Operation Epic Fury has been, has continued. The Straits of Hormuz have been closed. Energy supplies are not making their way out into the world. What's happening, whether it's in Europe, those regions we talked about, whether it's in Europe, China, Southeast Asia, stocks of crude oil, the world goes on. Stocks of crude oil are being drawn down or supplies are being reduced as refineries still have to keep operating because the world still needs energy, whether that's diesel fuel or gasoline or other chemicals. So as stocks of crude oil and other products continue to decline, both regional prices of these products continues to rise. And if there has been one bright spot, Tom, it's been the US has emerged as a key energy supplier to the world during this time.
So how does the loss of the energy exports we're talking about from the Strait impact the U.S. energy supply and demand?
I think that's one the world is looking at right now. And I say that because historically, we've heard the president talking about how the United States has become energy independent. And truly, over the last 10 years, 10, 15, 10, 12 years, we really have, meaning that we produce more energy than we import. So, what's happened now over the last 12 weeks since Operation Epic Fury started is that the US, which was once classified as the residual supplier to the world in terms of, let's say, supplying the world with crude oil, diesel fuel, gasoline exports, is that now we've become one of the largest suppliers in the world and one of the most critical suppliers in the world. And our energy exports right now are helping to reduce some of the supply shocks or at least buffer some of the supply shocks that regions of this world, specifically Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Europe are experiencing.
And for U.S. State and local governments and public entities, they've been seeing higher prices. Does that mean that they're going to see higher prices even, more so in the summer and for the rest of 2026?
You feel very confident, and our opinion is very strong that yes, we do expect supplies in the United States to remain tight as the US has become a key energy exporter right now and prices to remain higher. Put this into perspective. At the end of April, before Operation Epic Fury, the United States was exporting about, call it 3.5 million barrels of crude oil a day. The latest data from the Department of Energy shows that we're now exporting close to 5.6, 5.8 million barrels of oil a day. That's material, Tom. It's material for two reasons. It's material, number one, because that supply of crude oil that we're exporting is not being refined in the United States. And that loss of energy, or excuse me, that loss of production in the United States has the ability of what we're seeing right now. It's causing a supply shock, if you will, of tighter or reduced production of diesel fuel, reduce production of gasoline, and that's keeping prices certainly higher.
So, in the absence of energy being exported from the Gulf, as you're describing, the U.S. is emerging as a major exporter of crude and other refined products. How are you expecting this to play out for U.S. supplies and U.S. prices?
We'll take, for example, gasoline inventories. We know that municipalities are large purchasers or can be large, not purchasers, but rather users of gasoline for various fleets. Total gasoline stocks in the United States, Tom, are at a 5-year low and are continuing to trending lower. So we don't anticipate those stocks being built very rapidly. And this is occurring at a time of year where those gasoline stocks are becoming tighter as we're heading into peak driving season. Refineries in the US are running at about an estimated 95% capacity utilization, which makes them more vulnerable toward outages. These refineries need to go on a break. They normally do it during the summertime. So, what kind of all this means coming together is that as supplies are tighter in the US and in the world, we expect, gasoline prices, for example, to remain higher for longer. Specifically, when we look out over the next few months, we do see, gasoline futures continuing their current price levels at around 345 up to, possibly 370 per gallon.
So inventories of crude, U.S. inventories of crude, diesel, and gasoline are being reduced. Where are the shortages going to be most acutely felt? Like how does the impact of those shortages impact prices, and what's that going to mean for large, small, medium-sized state and local governments to other municipalities?
The US is broken down into something called PADs, or Petroleum Area Defense Districts. And what we see right now inside of those PADs, we believe that the data clearly shows this, is that those regions of the United States, or those PADs that do not have refining capacity, are the most vulnerable for sustained supply shortages and supply hikes. And that would specifically be the West Coast. Obviously, California has been in the news a lot lately. California, the refining capacity continues to dwindle down. I believe, Tom, the last time I looked, is that total crude oil refining capacity in the state of California is back below levels from the year 2000. That's the same applies for, let's say, the Pacific Northwest, Washington State, as well as Oregon, but also the Northeast. Really, when we look at our clients, and we've talked to some up in New England, that's around Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. Those states are specifically vulnerable, just like California, because even worse than California is that there's no refining capacity in the New England states. So those states, again, those regions of the country, the New England area, kind of the North Mid Atlantic, the West Coast, where there's an absence of refineries, will have to rely on imports from other parts of the United States. And at the same time, too, both of those regions, again, the West Coast and the East Coast, are heavily reliant on imports from not just other states in the lower 48, but also from other countries as well. So we again believe that energy prices, not just gasoline prices, but heating oil prices, diesel prices in the West Coast and in the upper Mid Atlantic to New England, we believe those prices should stay higher for longer as stocks are entering into and entering in are being depleted and are entering into an acute shortage.
I was just going to ask, so is it right to say that the US is either facing a national energy shortage, or is there a energy shortage in some of those regions right now?
100%. And I say that
Okay.
because when we look at, again, kind of the stock levels of crude oil in the United States, and we'll look at the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or commonly known as the SPR, to help provide a buffer against escalating prices, the administration, as well as other countries around the world, authorized I think, a half a billion barrel withdrawal from Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So as we stand right now, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in the United States is as low as it's been going back to May 2024, which is almost just shy of the lowest levels going back to 2023. So again, that's one indicator that we're looking at. But we're also looking too, as you mentioned, at those national stocks of gasoline, national stocks of diesel fuel, which with supplies are being consumed. They're not being replenished as quickly because there's an economic incentive to export those fuels into the world. The one energy component, if you will, that we have an abundance of is natural gas. And while we are exporting record levels of natural gas, there is an abundance of natural gas stocks in the United States. And as we enter into peak heating season, where air conditioning demand will continue to rise, or at least I'm up in Minnesota, and hopefully it starts to get warm up here. But as that demand for power increases, as temperature rises, we hope that some of utility bills at both the commercial level as well as the residential can be buffered by these large natural gas supplies.
So if the US is facing an energy shortage now, how is that going to impact large users across the country?
I mean, there's a lot of ambiguity regarding when is there going to be a conclusion to to epic fury? When will the United States and Iran agree on terms where the Strait of Hormuz can open? When we look at, like we mentioned very early on, as global stocks of crude oil and refined products, and here we'll call them fuels, are expected to, they're at critical levels. We're at a supply shortage now. We will be running at a supply deficit. This is globally. Estimates are starting for around late June, early July. So what that does for the U.S. is that as the world, as those regions, whether it's Europe, whether it's Southeast Asia, as those supplies continue to contract and reach a net deficit, those countries will continue to rely on the United States for exports. And as exports, as we've talked about, as that export demand for U.S. crude oil and refined fuels continues to grow, that means supplies aren't being replenished, and we can expect supplies to remain low throughout peak driving season into the fall, and we expect prices to remain higher. Again, when that Strait of Hormuz opens is anyone's guess right now, but that's something that the world is watching.
So how much time would it take to refill the US stocks or inventories? How long would it take them to return to a normal level?
We'd have to see, let's say, exports contract back to a normalized level. So going from an estimated 5.6 to 5.8 million barrels a day back down toward, let's say, like the 5-year mean, which would be about 3.5 million barrels a day. So at 3.5 million barrels a day to get us back over 400 million barrels from an estimated, call it like 350 million barrels in the strategic petroleum reserve back up to 400 million barrels. It's going to take some time. That's a few months of just dedicated refilling. And again, on the from the fuel side, I don't know, and I say that because the demand for U.S. gasoline and diesel fuel into both Latin America as well as into Asia is so great right now, and exporters are making so much money, and there's that because that economic incentive is there. That I think again, that phrase we can expect higher for longer. But I would expect, if there was the Strait of Hormuz was to be resolved and opened, let's say in the next, 30 days, we could expect stocks of, gasoline and diesel fuel to perhaps replenish themselves by December or January.
So it's going to take some time.
Yes.
I know you're not a geopolitical expert, and even the geopolitical experts don't necessarily know the answer to whether or not there's going to be an agreement anytime soon. But what would occur to U.S. crude oil and refined product prices if the strait is reopened?
There would be, we anticipated an immediate shock inside of the futures markets. Futures markets are one component of the pricing supply chain, if you will. So, we believe, or, kind of the data is showing, is that there are a lot of speculative interest and short-term speculative interest that are inside of these futures markets. Those futures markets are for crude oil, heating oil, and primary gasoline. So instantly, we would believe that there would be negative pricing repercussions where we would expect the price of West Texas Intermediate crude oil or Brent crude oil to retrace by anywhere from like 15 to 20%. Now, that's just a futures price. And there would be some negative price responses inside the gasoline and diesel fuel, or known as the heating oil futures markets as well. But there is a distinction, Tom, and I think that this is critical to note, is that inside that pricing hierarchy, like I mentioned, or supply chain, there's futures prices and then there's cash prices. And the cash price represents like the transaction of a physical good somewhere in the world. So for here, what we're talking about for our municipal clients is that what would the response be for cash prices of either diesel fuel or gasoline if that Strait of Hormuz would open? And we believe that those prices are stickier, meaning that
Mm.
if regional supplies of gasoline and heating oil are tight, that means that even though futures prices can contract, but again, if those supplies are tight, that means in the demand structure doesn't change for inside of the United States. And while those inventories are building, those cash prices can stay higher for longer.
So how long would it take for any price weakness to reach the wholesale level?
We estimate right now there would be, perhaps like some type of response. And we're seeing this right now kind of on a weekly basis. We go to the pump and we see, I don't know about down, you're in Texas, I'm up in Minnesota, and I had kind of a moment where I ran my hand through my hair. I said, how did the price of gas go up by 50 cents over a week? I'm in the Minneapolis area where there's two refineries. So we could expect, a softening to occur almost within a few weeks. But again, we believe that the price response or the price reverberations of opening the Strait of Hormuz, will take some time after initial price shock to work their way through to the wholesale level. And when to put a definitive time period on that would be difficult, but I
Right.
would expect to say, there would be an initial response immediately, and then that diffusion rate would occur perhaps over the course of, a 4 to 8 week period.
So, Walter, I'm going to finish up with one last question to kind of bring it back to how it is that state and local governments and public entities should be thinking about all this. What is it that they should be doing right now to adjust or prepare for? Maybe it's not, maybe the important question isn't the summer, maybe it's just the rest of 2026, but how is it that state and local governments and public entities should be thinking about that right now?
Tom, there's a lot to be thinking about in terms of energy. If I'm working at a state and local government, and whether it's AI, whether it's geopolitical shocks that occur inside the world, we want to be, as bankers inside of Hilltop or other, participants here, we want to be thinking about what type of products we can offer our clients to perhaps hedge some of those risks. There are tools that Hilltop Securities and the Commodity Business Group offers to help reduce those price risks, to really smooth out, let's say, the volatility in prices through the procurement process. So I would advise, any of our bankers, municipal advisors, to contact myself or Jerome Gaudry inside the Commodities Business Group to help kind of brainstorm, listen to the ideas of your clients, and to help identify, some solutions that may be palatable to help reduce price volatility at that state and local level.
Great. Well, thank you, Walter. I appreciate you taking time to record this podcast. It was great to have you.
Thanks, Cos, and always a pleasure to be here. And I hope you have a great Memorial Day weekend.
Thank you. And thanks very much to those who tuned in and downloaded our recording today. We appreciate you listening. Again, I'm going to thank Walter for joining me. I really enjoyed our discussion. And for those interested, you can see the recent Hilltop Securities economic, municipal, and commodities commentary and listen to our podcasts by going to hilltopsecurities.com/commentary. Thanks again, everyone. We look forward to bringing you more color in the future related to topics that intersect the world of politics, finance, and public finance. This has been Tom Kozlik from Hilltop Securities.